Acha, thank you very much for coming all. So it is time to start today's first day session 2A panel session on revisiting ethnography. My name is Masahiko Togawa. Before going to start keynote address, I would like to introduce something about Professor Obijit Dasgupta and his works. It is a great pleasure to introduce you today's keynote address, Professor Obijit Dasgupta, in the panel session, The Visiting Ethnography, Social Dynamics of Gohira Village in Bangladesh. Okay. At 6th International Conference of Bengal Studies. Yes. Now I would like to share the slide. Next slide. Okay. Obijit Dasgupta is professor at Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. He has a long years career for studying culture and society of South Asia and has published several books on agrarian relation in West Bengal, Bangladesh, population displacement, and issues of various minorities in South Asia. His recent publication, Development and Exile, the State Refugee Relation in India, Oxford University Press, 2016. It is highly appreciated by South Asian sociologists and anthropologists, particularly in the field of refugee studies and migration. Professor Dasgupta organized a variety of academic issues of peasant society, minorities, scheduled caste, and refugees of South Asia, and edited a collection of papers on margins, tribes, caste, and other social categories, 2012. It is now popular as a standard book in the field of sociology and anthropology. Another example is Minorities and State, Changing Social and Political Landscape of Bengal, edited by Obijit Dasgupta, Masahiko Togawa, and Abul Barkat. It is an outcome of a joint project between Indian scholars and Bangladeshi scholars, including Abul Barkat, on the issue of religious minorities and the state. The latest book, edited by Professor Obijit Dasgupta, is Kinship and Family Among Muslims in Bengal, 2021, which is an outcome of a joint project with Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And the following session after the keynote address intend to discuss the issue of revisiting the ethnographic studies of village society in South Asia and review the result of this project. The joint project of revisiting ethnography, social dynamics of Gohira village in Bangladesh is based on an ethnography by the late Professor Hara Tadahiko, who had a fieldwork at the Gohira village between 1962 to 64 in East Pakistan, and compiled his ethnography in 1967 as PhD thesis. In the last 50 years since his studies, the rural society of Bengal experienced drastic changes, such as the independence of Bangladesh, population increased from about 50 million in 1961 to 160 million in 2020, and rapid economic growth in recent years. So we can reflect on this development of the rural society of Bengal by reconsidering his ethnography. In today's keynote address by Professor Obijit Dasgupta, he discusses that the past appears in one's study in a very special way. So I would appreciate if you could find the past in your own studies through inspiring by the discussion of revisiting a village for research. Now, keynote address by Professor Abhijit Dasgupta, The Past in the Present, Revisiting a Village for Research. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Togawa, and thank you all for listening to today's keynote address, and thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed writing this because I did my fieldwork long time back in 1977 in a village. So I was thinking my own experience, what had happened when I was doing my fieldwork. And then I was trying to read the writings of some of my colleagues, about whom I have mentioned here. Most of the writers either were my teachers, for instance, Scarlett Epstein, or my colleague and teacher, Andre Bete. I knew them quite well. So this paper is little bit from my experience, from interactions with them, and also reading what they have had to say about fieldwork. It's all about fieldwork. Now, the main point that I'm trying to make here is that when we study as an anthropologist a village, we always try to see what happened in the past, whether it is family, kinship, marriage, land ownership. Now, we always try to know, how was it 50 years back? How was it 30 years back? These questions come to our mind. Past is an integral part of anthropological research, no matter what kind of problem you are doing. But today, we are going to talk about a special kind of past study when an anthropologist is trying to resurvey his or her own village. So you can see that here you have an anthropologist trying to explore the past in a very special way, to look at her or his own research. This is what the subject matter today, and I'll point out what are the problems and how they have tried to deal with those problems. Field work is not easy, although some writers say that, we enjoy field work, but that's one kind of view. If you want to know more about this, that what happens in the field and what sort of experience that we get, there are two very interesting books that came out in India, one edited by M.N. Srinivas and others, called Field Worker and the Field, the other edited by Andre Bete and T.N. Madan. Excellent two books. You will find many anthropologists, sociologists, they're discussing their experiences in the field. So I will ask you to see some of these books to get an idea what actually happens, all kinds of experiences. Now, coming back to resurvey, studying one village after 25 years or after 30 years. Now, here you have two types of village study. One is that the same anthropologist going to his or her village to do the resurvey. As it happened in the case of Scarlett Epstein, she studied two villages in Karnataka, and then after 20 years, she went back to those two villages. It was also true of Ian Bremen, who studied some villages in Gujarat. He studied in 1973, then he went back to those villages and he did resurvey thrice. In Bangladesh, there are some important studies. One is by Willem Vanish Kendall, who resurveyed a village studied by Ramakrishna Mukherjee. And there is another one by a lady Dutch anthropologist whose book is quite well known in Bangladesh called Geograpur. It is written by Yeneke Arends. Yeneke went back to her village again and restudied. Professor Hara had the same thing in mind, to resurvey his own village. So he went back, but unfortunately, he was unable to complete. He fell ill and he passed away. So we don't have Professor Hara's account of resurvey, but he was trying to do exactly the same what I said about Van Schendel or Arends. So you can see that anthropologists try to do in their own way this kind of study. And after a gap of 20 years or 30 years, it was not very common in the 1960s because there was no funding for this. But after some time, it was realized that this data is extremely important. If you resurvey your village after 20 years or after 30 years, you get a kind of data which will show you the nature of change. And policymakers, politicians, administrators, they're all interested in knowing about change. Okay? And that's why they started funding this kind of project. And many sociologists, social anthropologists, particularly from the Western countries, they started doing the resurvey of their villages. Now, I said the author goes back to study the village, but I can give you examples where an independent researcher is doing the village study. Willem Schendel is one of them. Or you can take the example of a British anthropologist, Simpson. He had a very ambitious project. He took up 3 villages. One studied by Adrian Mayer in 1957. The other village studied by David Pocock in Gujarat, Adrian Mayer's village in Madhya Pradesh, and the third village that he took was by F.G. Bailey in Orissa. So you can see that a researcher, trying to resurvey village of Adrian Mayer, Bailey, and others. So this trend is quite noticeable, as you all know that Professor Hara's village is being resurveyed by Bangladeshi anthropologists. So this is not uncommon. And I have given an example where Ian Bremen tries to say that what are the advantages of doing this kind of resurvey? And of course, he is trying to point out that if you are interested in studying changes in economic life, in political life, okay, then this kind of resurvey is ideal. So let us keep that in mind, and I will give more examples from time to time to give you an idea about how this kind of resurveys are going on in all parts of the world now. But there are problems, and this is the main focus of my study. Resurvey is not easy, in my opinion. It is a very difficult task, and an anthropologist has to deal with the problem how to do a good resurvey. And to do that, you have to know what are the problems. And I'll mention a couple of problems that if, as an anthropologist, you are interested in doing your resurvey of your village, I'll just tell you after, say, 20 years, what are the problems that you are likely to face. The first problem is what I call the demographic problem. After 30 years, you will see that the people who responded to the questions with whom you shared a lot of time, your experiences, they're not there anymore. They passed away or they have left the village and they're not there. So 20 years, 30 years is a long gap. So you don't find them. If you go to a village after, say, more time, 40 years, for instance, as anthropologists went to Hara's village, many respondents said that they don't remember about this field study uh, because they were too small at the time. And those who knew, some of them had left the village. So this tremendous demographic change is a problem. And one should know how to deal with this demographic change. So what you do then? You use your memory and you discuss with the respondent. But use of one's memory is not easy. The memory of one's is just like an archive. And I would like to say it's more like an old written page that you try to decipher, discover what is written there. It just doesn't come automatically. Okay? So after 30 years, say let's take 30-year period, many things you do remember, many things you don't remember. And sometimes you never know whether you were getting the right answer. So these are the problems, that huge demographic change can only leave you with some questions, some people, and also you have to depend mostly on your memory. The second problem is a debate which is very popular in many parts of the world, particularly in the United States. Ha, key. Okay, so United States, Japan. Now this argument is this, that the villages don't exist anymore. They are just like cities and towns. Villages have all the amenities, just like the one that you find in an urban area. So they have disappeared. This is one kind of argument. Now, in my opinion, that is one-sided argument, and it's not always true. There are hundreds and thousands of villages in India, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, everywhere in South Asia, where you don't find this kind of urbanization, this kind of change. So although people are debating that is there a village is disappearing, particularly when you look at the census data, they say a drop of the number of the villages. They have significantly dropped. So which means that the villages are disappearing or they have disappeared completely. So how do we deal with this kind of problem? This is the second. Uh, for instance, in Hara's village, a lot of changes have happened. But you can see that still there are rural side of the village. The urbanization hasn't taken over completely. So I have doubts about that theory, about villages have disappeared or disappearing very fast. My third problem is about political problem. Political problem is this, that if you look at the study, for instance, by Willem van Schendel, he studied the village in 1973. That village was studied by Ramakrishna Mukherjee in 1948. Yes, 40. So that was under the just independent, after independence. So it was under East Pakistan. So what Phelan did in 1973 was a study of a village of an independent state of Bangladesh. You can see the structural change, macro politics changed, an independent state. Similarly, if you look at the study, for instance, by Simpson, as I mentioned, Adrian Mayer's case is very interesting. Adrian Mayer's case, when he first went to study a village in Madhya Pradesh, it was under the British rule. Then he went to study again that village, it was under the Indian government. Okay. So, and lots of changes have happened. When you have an independent state, you have all kinds of problems. So if you take Bangladesh, for instance, it within the last 80 years, it was under the British rule. From the British rule, it went to East Pakistan, became East Pakistan, and then an independent state of Bangladesh. That you can see that the macro level politics or political structure changes, and that creates problem for the anthropologist, because with the changes in politics, you have lots of new political institutions they enter, and you have to start all over again. Look at these new institutions. For instance, in India, there was nothing like, you know, universal adult franchise, free voting. That happened only after independence. So that sort of political changes at the macro level, at the micro level, at different levels will create problem for an anthropologist who is going to study or resurvey a village. So how do we deal with the problem? Now, methodologically, I think there are some ways to deal with, and most anthropologists have done that, to have a new set of questions, to look at it completely from a new perspective. So world questionnaire, you can leave it when you do the resurvey, but as you can see that they're not so relevant. So you have to have a set of new questions. Now, when you prepare a set of new questions, I can tell you that you have three possibilities. One is that you can see there are some areas where the changes are drastic. Too many changes, too radical changes. As I said about politics. Politics, if you look at local level politics, you will see huge sea change in politics. There are areas where you find only minimal changes. Say, for instance, family, kinship, marriage. All those areas we considered as traditional areas. Traditions change slowly. So that's why I said minimal changes, not huge, drastic changes. And there are areas where you will not find much change at all. I'll give you one example. That intercaste relationship, those who are interested in studying, in many parts of India, you will find the intercaste relationship, particularly the relationship between a Brahmin and a Dalit, is no different from the kind of relationship they had, say, 50 years ago. So this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that these are the areas where things haven't changed at all. Say, for instance, marriage in a village, particularly in a remote village, in a Hindu village, the same caste marriage is still practiced. That is the preferable choice. So you can see hardly any change. This is what my point is. So your questionnaire, when you prepare them, these questions have to be kept in mind about the nature of change, whether huge or just minimal or the list. Okay, that will help significantly to deal with the problem. Now, let me tell you about the theories and concepts that you also have to relook, reconsider, re-examine when you begin your resurvey of the village. The best example that you will find if you take a look at Ben Shandel's book called Peasant Mobility, where he resurveyed Ramakrishna Mukherjee's villages in Gohira district in Bangladesh. Now, Van Schandel is saying that the theories that Ramakrishna Mukherjee used, to him, they're not entirely satisfactory. So what you see is that, for instance, he was studying mobility pattern. Peasants who have done very well, peasants who have not done well, all these kinds of problems he was interested in. But then he saw that Ramakrishna Mukherjee's theories were not helping him much. So if you look at the book, you will see that he mentioned the use of the theory of Shanin's peasant mobility, which he found in the case of Bangladesh very suitable. And he completely changed the model, and he used the mobility theory from the point of view of what the, the Shanin's theory said about the peasant mobility in the Russian context. So what Phelim has done is that he talked about three different types of mobility, which you will not find in Ramakrishna Mukherjee's book. In the resurvey, he talked about centripetal mobility, that they're all coming. This is leveling, or centrifugal mobility, that's poor becoming poorer and rich richer. Or there can be cyclical mobility, that like a cycle, it goes up and down and up and down. So mobility patterns can be different. That is what he used from Shanin's theory. So here you have an example that old theories don't work. So you have to use new theories to test what you want to find out. Okay, let me now slightly shift from this anthropological, sociological, intensive village studies to the state. It's not correct to say only anthropologists collect this kind of data, resurvey, to show you how changes have happened. The state from time to time also do the same. And I'll give you some examples. The best example that you will find in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka is what we call the census survey. Census survey is every 10 years that the state has a huge manpower for this, that they go to villages, to each household to get information about demography, the family members and all. And this exercise will go on after every 10 years. In India, it started in 1872 and then 1881. And since then, it has been going on. And then the current one is this year in 2021. They haven't started yet because of extraordinary situation, but we expect that it will be done soon. But this is an extremely important resurvey data by the state. And we all use, anthropologists, sociologists use census data very extensively. Second, besides census, the state has its own institutions, organizations. Say, for instance, an organization called the NSSO, National Sample Survey Organization. What do? They go to some villages to study, say, for instance, the employment opportunities. And they will go back to that village after 10 years to study what sort of changes have taken place. So you have organizations who are doing this kind of exercise. They're extremely important. Some of these data, economists have used this kind of data very extensively. But the state, I have to say, is not always there to share information, data with all of us. And the best example that you find, if you look at the recent data that they are using in the Citizenship Act. Who are the citizens, who are not citizens, who have crossed the boundary and claimed citizenship. Now, this is a very controversial and sensitive issue, but the state has its data. And since this is very sensitive, state collects data systematically, but unfortunately, academicians do not have access to this data. But I must say, the state also has this sort of data which they don't share with others. That's a pity. I mean, that's a problem that we face as an anthropologist. If you ask me to comment on CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act in India, which will give citizenship to many citizens, except non-Muslim citizens, not Muslim. So if I have to comment, it's very difficult for me because I don't have the official data. The official data are not being shared by anthropologists and sociologists. So that sort of problem we face with the state data. But in many countries, census data in Bangladesh, it's very systematic. In Sri Lanka, I have noticed census data collection done very systematically. Besides census, remember that another source of information that will also give you an idea about resurvey, restudy of one area. That's the district gazetteers, which the British started. For instance, if you are interested in studying the district gazetteer, say Burdwan district, you will find the first one that the British prepared, say, for instance, in 1895. What is interesting is that the independent Indian government has taken initiative to do the same kind of survey that the Britishers did to prepare the gazetteers. So you have a set of new gazetteers by the independent state. This has happened also in Bangladesh. You have gazetteers now compiled by the Bangladesh state. So they are extremely important gazetteers. And also land survey settlement reports. So you can see the state has its own source of information, which collected not at one point of time, but which they revisit, recollect after 20 years, after 30 years, and so on. So these are also very important sources of information. How much time do you think I can? 5 minutes?
You have still enough time. You have still
Okay.
enough time.
Okay. All right. So now let me point out some of the problems I said about the methodological problem, the theoretical problem of doing resurvey, and how an anthropologist can deal with some of these problems. Okay. And I have also pointed out how the state is collecting the data from time to time, doing the resurvey and collecting information. Uh, but I also pointed out the main argument is that it's difficult to do this exercise, and one has to be very careful about collecting this information, and one has to think about one's method very carefully. And then we come to the question of methodology, that is, how do we do this exercise? It's not mechanical at all. And if you say that Scarlett Epstein, Ian Breman, Van Schendel, or Ahrens, they have all done mechanical exercise, not at all. You have to see their books and you will see that how innovative they were. When they saw that things have changed in their villages, that then they started thinking of something new and they tried to use those new methods to study it. One point I want to say that there are many such villages that we have not done a resurvey. they are very well-known villages. For instance, the village studied by M.N. Srinivas in Karnataka. Or take, for instance, a village classic study in Bengal, in the Bardwan district, studied by Lal Bihari Dey, which has been referred to in many texts. Now, that village has not been resurveyed, restudied. But the ethnography of that village is so unique and excellent that someone should do this study after 150 years. It doesn't matter that we have spent so much time after that. But, as I am told that if you go to that village, only you will find some sort of uh, relic where they say that Lal Bihari, they stayed in this village and studied the village. So we have enormous scope of doing this kind of resurvey and studying in all these countries, in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and all. And we'll get to know more how things have changed. In different spheres, in economy, in politics, in religion, in social practices. And if you are interested in studying change, then this is the only way out. Now, I have one point to mention is that although we support this idea of doing field work, resurvey, there is a problem. Problem is this, that if you go to one village, the same village, too many times, there is a chance that others will get to know the identity of the village. Because if you look at Ian Bremen's study, the villages in Gujarat, he has written so extensively, he has published so many books, and any reader who is going through those books, it will not be difficult for him to find out. So to keep the identity of the villages as anonymous, that others should not know, then it becomes very difficult. If one goes to one village too many times. So that is the problem that I have mentioned in my paper, is that one has to be sensitive about this, that one should keep in mind that the anonymity of the villages is extremely important, or they should not know. And wherever it's possible, every time, they should use the pseudonyms, fictitious names for all this. That, moreover, I think what is important for an anthropologist to know, that his or her presence is not affecting their everyday life. That we should consider very carefully, that they also have a life and they also have regular, work and all. So doing a resurvey in same villages too many times, I think has this kind of problems, and sociologists and anthropologists, they have to consider them carefully before undertaking this kind of resurvey. Okay, so this is all I have. I can discuss more if you have questions on this. But in its present form, I have just tried to highlight some of these problems, and in the revised version, you will get more. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for very interesting, stimulating discussion, various current issues of village studies and rural society, including citizenship issue, but in the context of historical background of development of anthropology and sociology of South Asia. So now I would like to open the question to the floor. If you have any question or comment, I would appreciate to receive. So before making question, please identify yourself, name and affiliation, and then start to speak. So anyone, please make question now.
Then shall I question?
Yes, yes, please. Sugie-san.
I'm Sugie from Nara University, Japan. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I'm really happy to see you again.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy too.
I have one question and another one is like comment. What do you think if one researcher want to restudy an area that has studied by another researcher, should he or she take permission from or ask cooperation of the previous researcher if possible? How are the cases of previous studies, restudies?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's very important. You have something more to say?
Actually, if I want to study another villages that another researcher studied before, should I take permission from him or she to restudy the village?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's an important point. Now, permission is not required, but I think in a spirit of uh, scholarship or give and take, it is a good idea always to meet the anthropologist. And I know that Willem mentioned did go and meet Ramakrishna Mukherjee and discuss, as he shared that with me. There are anthropologists who do that. Even Simpson, I mentioned this British anthropologist who studied these three villages, Baileys and Adrian Mayer and David Pocock. He met all of them and discussed, not permission, that they can give you a lot of insights, a lot of information. So if you are not the person who studied the village, if someone else has studied the village and you are interested to revisit that village, okay, if that person is still alive, for instance, it's not possible to meet Lal Bihari Dey, who studied the village in Burdwan district. He passed away a long time back. But if someone is still alive, it's always good to share your ideas, get some new questions, new views. So that permission is not, I mean, the village doesn't belong to one anthropologist. So formally that sort of permission is not necessary. But knowing, and I know in some cases anthropologists have shared their data. You know, for instance, Scarlett Epstein's village was studied by another student, and Scarlett Epstein had given, she didn't study education very much. She studied economic system, economic life. And the student of Scarlett Epstein was interested in studying education in the village. So she gave all her data to her student about education in the village. So it is always a good idea to meet the anthropologist if he's alive and take his advice.
Thank you. Actually, Professor Tadahiko Hara regrettably not available now, but we could meet his son actually in Japan by Togawa, Professor Togawa's. So then another my question or comment. Actually, when I conduct field work, even not the study after the 2 or 3 decades, I many times faced different answers from one person to the same, and also contradicted stories from many people. So it was difficult to identify what was the fact or what was the true histories.
Yes.
So I think that anthropologists or those who take ethnographic approach,
Yeah,
they should seek how people, including researchers,
yeah,
recognize reality or construct history,
yeah,
how those
yeah,
have been changing along the flow of time, rather than
yeah.
to seeking the fact or truth, I think. What do you think?
Yes, 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 yes. It's an extremely important point. You know, historians have done a lot of work on that. You know, the mental construction, it differs from person to person. You know, you ask one question to a villager X, he will give you an answer, say about landholding. And you ask about a dispute that happened with the land. You ask another person, his construction of the entire thing will be very different, maybe very different. So another person will say, and they'll also give you the history, how it happened. So a true anthropologist has to find out how to deal with it. You know, as some anthropologists say that you always cross-examine. You know, two persons have given you information. You ask the third person. Okay, and if you see that the third person's version is tallying with the first one, okay, then you are more or less you can be sure that it's safe what you are saying. So it is a methodological problem, and one has to find out how to deal with it,
Mm,
and that's in the field that's possible.
Thank you very much for insightful answers. Thank you
Yeah.
very
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So any other question or comment? Mm,
I think I have received some.
anyone? Uh,
Uh,
please speak out if you have. Otherwise, it is almost the end of the time. Now the fixed time. So I need to close. Oh, okay. So I have another last question. Maybe anyone
yeah.
who want to? Okay, I have one question. How do you think in my graduate school at university, I have a lot of literature to study, such as Srinivas, Louis Dumont, Maki Marriott, and NK both for village studies, and also had a PhD survey in village society in West Bengal. But
Yeah.
in my class in anthropology in younger generation, in student, we still continue to teach them to study literature of village studies, and they need to survey at village, or they need to another dimension, an urban area or other spaces for studies. How
Yeah.
about your opinion?
Yes. The old style of village study, what Srinivas did, or Andhra did, or even Professor Hara did, this kind of study is not very popular nowadays among the students. From my experience in teaching, I can tell you very few students, except I can see Atri, who was interested in doing this kind of intensive study in the village. That is not a very popular topic. Even during my time, when I applied for PhD and in Delhi University, initially I joined Delhi University, they asked me, and I still remember the head of the department, you want to take up an old-fashioned study of a village? You want to go? No one is interested now. Okay. So the interest has shifted, and I think what has happened is that some areas of villages, the climate change, forest, environment is extremely popular nowadays with the students, or say women's question, or the entire land rights, So that kind of old village study to look at the morphology of the village, that is not popular anymore. They are now, students are doing more uh, studies on different aspects of the village life than studying one village for a very long time. So I would think that even in Japan, if I would little experience that I had, even there also we see students are interested more about these new emerging issues. And why not? They are important. They are important. The question of religious intolerance, for instance, it's extremely important. If an anthropologist can do and contribute something on that, we should welcome. So that sort of change I can see very clearly, and I will argue with you. I agree that there is a shift in the emphasis now, and we should welcome. But this kind of resurvey of the village, that has a very different kind of meaning. And if an anthropologist, no matter whether she studied women's question in the village, if she goes back after 20 years, after 25 years, that's something very new, unique, which I discussed today, and has many kinds of problems. So it has its own value. That is what I will argue.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much for
Thank
very
you.
interesting
Thank you so much. Thank you.
presentation.
Yeah.
So it is time to close the keynote address. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Okay, so this session is continuing after 10 minutes. It will reopen at 2 o'clock for the second part. So thank you very much, Professor. That's good. Today's keynote address is closed here. Thank you.
Thank you.